Hello. Welcome to this important conversation with these dignified and so well-experienced speakers. We're glad you joined us today at Funeral Consumers Alliance. This is our gift to the community of CEUs on important topics. So we want you to know who's here. And I'm letting the speakers know that in a minute I'm going to ask each speaker in turn to stand so the camera can show our audience who to expect soon. This has been exciting to learn how to partially go virtual and how to make technology our friend with our wonderful videographer. So today you're going to hear from 5 speakers. The first is coming to us virtually, and so you will hear from her host. Each speaker has a host from our board. The host will introduce, and the speaker will be with you. 2 of them are already pre-recorded, and the others are here to meet. So, in order, Peg Sandine, who is speaking to us from Death with Dignity, will be here on video. The second speaker, I want to get them in order right because that's the whole point here, is Reverend Bowers. Am I reading that right? No, Father Curran. Okay, the second speaker is Father Curran, and now he's going to stand up so we can see him. He said he's wearing his sin-fighting suit. Father Curran. So thank you, sir. We'll meet him shortly. The second speaker is Reverend Melissa Bowers. And there she is. Carefully COVID. See how careful we are? We're socially distanced. We want our speakers all in good health. The next speaker is Manal Shabir. And she will be speaking on the A view of the Muslim perspective about medical aid in dying. And finally, Dr. John Lantos, who is also here virtually, will be with you talking about, this is ethics CEUs, talking about the ethics surrounding medical aid in dying. We're glad you're here. This is valuable and important, and it needs your voice as well, whatever your conclusions are. So let's proceed with our exciting group of speakers.
Good morning. I'm Steve Knight, 16-year board member of the Funeral Consumers Alliance, Greater Kansas City. I was recruited by my neighbor, then FCA President Bev McGill, who knew I was a retired journalist and insisted that I should edit the FCA's newsletter. We only produce 2 of them a year, but they are major efforts with 8 or 12 pages of funeral industry topics. They remain surprisingly current despite the passage of time and are still available on our website. Let me show you some of them. First slide. This is our latest newsletter with a story announcing this annual meeting on the right side, and another one announcing that the historic Elmwood Cemetery, the resting place of many of Kansas City's early leaders, has removed its requirement for outer burial containers, which means it can once again permit natural burial, also known as green burial. Our FCA board has consistently supported natural burial over the years, but with very little effect on the funeral industry. Natural burial means no embalming, no concrete grave liners, no metal caskets. These things are designed to prevent the body from being exposed to the earth. Natural burial requires using biodegradable containers of wood, cardboard, or simple shrouds. This allows the body to eventually return to the earth where it can rejoin the cycle of life. In fact, the headline says another cemetery welcomes natural burial. Actually, it's the only cemetery in this metropolitan area that offers it, that is open to the public. Muslim and Jewish cemeteries offer it, but they're not open to the public. Why is the industry so resistant? Profits. There's a lot of profit in embalming, steel caskets, and grave liners. The flip side is that consumers can save $1,000 or more with natural burial. It's also the most environmentally friendly option. Embalming contaminates the body and the earth. The energy it takes to manufacture and transport steel caskets and grave liners contaminate the atmosphere. The large amount of fossil fuel burned in cremation does the same. Slide 2, please. Here is another natural burial story. It proves consumer demand at the Highland Cemetery of Prairie Village. The open grave on the left contains the shrouded body of my good friend from childhood, Nick Delano. In the photo on the right, family members lower the body of a woman in a cardboard casket into a grave. Highland Cemetery sold all of its 150 remaining grave sites in the last 4 years, mostly to people seeking natural burial. Slide 3. Here's a story on the left about death cafes, where people gather just to talk about death and eat cake. And another story on the right is about water cremation. Slide 4. Here's Megan Mooney. She writes about the 5 things she's learned hosting death cafes. Slide 5. Here's a story about Sister Lucy Walter, who has arranged the funerals of over 200 of her Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth. Slide 6. This is past President Bev McGill, who recruited me, and she tells how she applied the lessons that she learned during her years on our board to her husband's funeral. It was the very best funeral ever, she said. Slide 7. A story about the rapid growth of pet cremations. Slide 8. This one touched our hearts. 29-year-old Tyler Fracassa, father of 3, with another on the way, was killed in an auto accident. His wife, Rachel, arranged with a funeral home to have his body brought home for a home funeral and a natural burial on the family property. She said it helped the family to deal with his loss, including the children. Slide 9. That's Tyler on the left. At the right are 3 of his children and a couple of neighbor kids on his grave. Why do we at the Funeral Consumers Alliance volunteers concern ourselves so much about death? I think one of the lessons Megan Mooney learned hosting death cafes comes close to the answer. The way to see death, the way to see how beautiful life is from the vantage point of death, she says. Our views on death inform the way we live. You may think all of this focusing on death is morbid, and in some ways, I guess it is. But I submit, it's a healthy brand of morbid. Thank you.
Steve. Well, my name is Sally King, and I'm a past president of the Funeral Consumer Alliance here in Kansas City. I'm also a clinical social worker and have worked in the field of end of life and mental health for almost 20 years. Funeral Consumer Alliance is very close to my heart, and I've been very involved and hope to continue to be involved as I can, working part-time. I'm so excited to announce that we get to continue these educational events, and it has become a FCA tradition over the years to give these end-of-life conversations to social workers and nurses. And when we were approached with the idea of looking at the issue of MAID, medical aid in dying, I was a little hesitant around that. I didn't know how I felt about that. I come from a family and a history of faith, and but knew that this was an important conversation that many states were needing to have as things are changing in the world we live in, especially medically. I lost my mother 8 years ago. We were able to do a partial green burial for her, and that was an amazing experience. That changed me forever, and I feel as though it's sort of my call to continue what we're doing today. With that, I want to introduce Peg Sandine. Her personal story is very compelling. She's very accomplished, but most importantly, she's a social worker, like many of us here. She is a national lightning rod for illuminating the life and death experiences that raise questions around choices at the end of life. I am intrigued by her work and of my own professional and personal uncertainty about my commitments around this, but I'm interested in hearing what she has to say as well as the rest of our panel today. As she engages you with the remarks she's recorded for us on Wednesday, I believe that you will see that she is articulate, she's thoughtful, and with that, I give you Peg Sandine.
Hi, everybody, and I am just so happy to be here with you today talking about something that I am very passionate about, end-of-life care and death with dignity in particular. I so wish that I could be with you there today. I just with COVID and the world just being all up in the air as it is, I decided not to be up in the air in terms of flying and come to you safely from my office here in Portland, Oregon, where it is rainy and overcast, as is the case this time of year. But again, I'm so pleased to be here and pleased to talk to you today about Death with Dignity. I wanted to give you just an overview of who I am, and it was a fabulous introduction that I got there, but I just wanted to dig in to be a little more in depth about some of the things about me. I'm a social worker by training, and so lots of things that you will hear today are really sort of at my core of who I am in my profession. And I have been an end-of-life care social worker almost my entire career since I got my MSW. So I have very close ties to hospice, and I got my MSW from the University of Iowa in 1997. And very much after that, I spent most of my time with people who were dying as their social worker. And then after I got my PhD, I actually went into more policy work. So now I work with legislators and lobbyists and grassroots activists and grass tops folks and the whole gamut, governors, lobbyists, I'll say that again, doing end-of-life care policy work to make sure that we have the type of end-of-life care policy that we need in this country. Some other pieces about who I am and what brought me here today. I have a PhD in social work and social research from Portland State University here in Portland, Oregon. And for those of you who don't know Portland State, it's a university much like UMKC in Kansas City. It's an urban university. It brings folks from all around. It's a big, sprawling, beautiful campus. So if you know UMKC's campus, Portland State is very much like it. There's schools that are very, very similar. And again, my PhD is in social work and social research, so it sort of marries that individual level work with people who are dying with a social research lens, so looking at big data sets and numbers. I'm not going to dig into statistics today and chi-square and standard deviation and all those things, but I can answer those questions if you need me to. I'm a fellow in HIV prevention leadership at the CDC. And so I have, while I am a social worker, I have very deep public health roots from my time as a fellow at the CDC. And then who I am personally, I'm a cyclist. I've done RAGBRAI in Iowa, the big long bike ride. It was canceled this year, but I really wanted to do it. So I'm very much a cyclist. I'm an urban farmer. Right outside my window here, a little itty-bitty urban flock of chickens that we have eggs every day. My art in my office sort of reflects the urban farmer that I am because I'm an Iowan. And, I have strong Midwestern roots, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to speak with you today is because I wanted to come back to the Midwest, which did not happen. But I do have those ties. I've been with Death with Dignity professionally for about 15 years. And again, so almost my entire career I've been doing this. And then the last thing I will end on is, again, I wanted to be there with you today because my daughter lives in Kansas City, Missouri. But alas, it's not. 2020 was not going to bring us what we thought it was going to. So let's talk a little bit about Death with Dignity and just sort of, some of you may know a lot about it and some of you very little. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time here really getting us oriented to what is Death with Dignity and what exactly is the process. So Death with Dignity has a lot of names. It's Death with Dignity, physician-hastened dying, physician-assisted dying, medical aid in dying is the term that you hear most often in terms of what is the medical practice. So again, that's medical aid in dying, or MAID, as you will see it if you do some research. I call it Death with Dignity. That's what it was named in the original piece of legislation in the United States that was passed in Oregon in 1994. So that's what I call it. But I'm talking about all of those things when I'm talking about Death with Dignity. So what is it? It's a state policy. It's a state enacted law, so state by state. And there are 9 jurisdictions with these laws, and they are Oregon, Washington, Vermont, California, Colorado, the District of Columbia, Hawaii, Maine, and New Jersey. And what the policy is a safeguarded process for patients to follow in order to become qualified to receive a prescription to hasten death. And it provides guidelines for physicians and pharmacists to follow in order to prescribe and dispense life-ending medications. So essentially, if you pull up the Oregon Death with Dignity statute, or the one in Washington or Vermont or Colorado, California, DC, they all look very similar. And you can read them from one or two lenses. One is, what are the steps that a patient needs to do to become a qualified patient to receive a prescription to hasten death? And then what are the steps that a physician has to do in order to prescribe? And that's all the Death with Dignity Act is. It's rather long, but it is very much just the steps from the patient point of view and from the physician point of view. At its core, the Death with Dignity Act in every jurisdiction is a standard of care. So it's what physicians need to do in order to prescribe if a patient requests a hastened death. It's exactly what the law is meant to do. So what it is not, there are many things that people talk about that Oregon Death with Dignity is, and it's actually not those things. So it's not euthanasia, which is typically when a physician would inject a patient to death. And euthanasia is criminalized by all of the death with dignity statutes in the country and through various pieces of self-standing legislation around the country. So euthanasia is not lawful anywhere in the United States. In fact, it's unlawful in most jurisdictions in the world. This is also not assisted suicide, which is criminalized by all the Death with Dignity Acts in the country. So this is not an act of a physician injecting a patient to end their life. This is a patient self-ingesting or self-administering medication to hasten death under really narrow circumstances. And we're going to talk about those circumstances a lot today. And Death with Dignity is also not suicide. So people who use Death with Dignity want to live, but they're dying. They don't have a choice. They're already dying. And so the choice that they are making, the option that they are taking, is to control the timing and manner of their death. But their choice to live has already been stripped away from them by their diagnosis, their prognosis, their disease, which is most frequently cancer. So Death with Dignity is an option at the end of life, but it is not euthanasia, assisted suicide, or suicide. And I will say, just as a social worker who has worked with many, many, many patients who have opted to use Death with Dignity, they have said to me over and over, this is not suicide. I'm not committing suicide. I don't want to die. I'm going to die. Right. And so, their pleas to me very much demonstrate that they're very different from a suicidal population that is living, could continue to live, but doesn't want to do so anymore. These are very, very different populations. So what are the underlying principles? So again, sort of when I think about Death with Dignity, or I think about pieces of legislation, because I said what I do mostly is policy work. I also teach policy work to social work students around the country. So when I think about a state law, I think, what are the underlying principles? Like, what is this legislature trying to accomplish when it passes a law? So the underlying principles related to Death with Dignity are autonomy, self-determination, dignity, non-abandonment, and the respect for the patient and the physician relationships. So again, if you think about those principles, autonomy, self-determination, dignity, non-abandonment, respect for a patient-physician relationship, you're really getting to underlying principles in end-of-life care in general, in hospice, and in fact, I would argue in medical care in general. So really what this statute does is it brings together those ideas and sets a process to them. And again, these are ideals that very much are important to me from my hospice background, from my social work background. How do we make sure that we honor a patient's autonomy and self-determination and offer them as many options as they can, especially when they're dying? Because when you think about when people are dying, their options become closed to them and closed to them and closed to them. So what Death with Dignity does is it opens up the options at end of life just a little bit. We want to talk about dignity and non-abandonment. And what I mean by that is the physicians in the room or those who work with physicians understand this concept that what happens when a patient requests a hastened death, and the concept that a physician will not abandon their patient. So very much this principle of non-abandonment. And then Death with Dignity is all about the relationship between a patient and physician. Everything about the statutes that are existing are about this relationship. So again, these are the underlying principles related to Death with Dignity. And then sort of like after I think about principles, I think about concepts. So as we sort of get from the broad, right, to the more specific in terms of Death with Dignity. Death with Dignity is a patient-controlled process. So that means that nobody else can do it for the patient. Someone can't request on behalf of someone else to have Death with Dignity. Again, I mentioned earlier, there's no injections, like a physician cannot inject a patient. It's a patient-controlled process. The process can stop any time. Once a patient starts the process, they don't have to continue. So at every step, this is a patient-controlled process from beginning to end. And again, another underlying concept is self-administration. And I mentioned this earlier, this is very important. No injections are allowed, no euthanasia is allowed under any of the Death with Dignity Acts across the country. And another underlying concept is there's choice for all participants. So the patient can opt to use Death with Dignity or not. The physician can opt to write a prescription or not. The physician can completely opt out. And in fact, healthcare institutions can opt out. Entire healthcare institutions can say, nope, we're not doing this. On our premises, we do not believe it's the role of medicine or it is inconsistent with our values. And so we will not allow this. So that means that for everyone involved who could potentially be involved, there is choice. Pharmacists do not have to fill the prescription if they do not agree with it. So there's choice for everyone involved. Death with Dignity is a prescribing only law. So what it is again, I talked about all of the steps that the patient has to go through and all of the steps that the physician has to go through. This is a prescribing only law. There's not another vehicle to induce death in a patient. It has to be prescription. And again, I talked about the underlying kind of idea that this is a medical standard of care. So what we're trying to do is give medicine a series of steps that it has to follow if a patient requests a hastened death. And we're shining a bright light. I think of this like what we're doing is we're providing a state sanction or a state oversight saying, if you're going to do this, because the research demonstrates and has for a very long time, the research demonstrates that physicians help their patients hasten death in all 50 states, in all jurisdictions, all the time. And so what this law does is it says, if you as a physician are going to do this, this is how you're going to do it. You're going to follow these steps, and we're going to highlight and tell you what you're going to do and set out parameters. So there's no loose cannons. This is a very, very narrow practice. So this establishes a medical standard of care. And it uses legislation to define who qualifies, and it uses legislation to protect vulnerable individuals. So if we think about what is a state's role in passing a piece of legislation in general, just conceptually, a state's role is to, grant something to someone over here, while at the same time protecting everyone else, so harming no individuals. And so Death with Dignity strikes this balance very, very well. It uses legislation to define who qualifies, but also uses legislation to protect vulnerable individuals, and it sets a very good tension. The laws that are existing are very successful in making sure that the state is able to provide something to this group of individuals while at the same time protecting vulnerable individuals using a series of safeguards. So I just want to step back. I have 3 patient stories to share with you, and I just wanted to step back and share one of them. I wanted to talk about a person named John who was 32 at the time, maybe 33, and HIV positive. And this was in the 90s. And his doctor said to him, "I will keep you alive as long as you want me to." And I was actually present in the room when the physician said this, and I was sort of taken aback. So take yourself back to the 90s, right? And think about medical care at the time, which it's very different than it is today in some ways. And so this patient, John, really, he wanted to live, and he wanted to throw all of medicine at his illness, and he just worked very, very hard. And one of the things that happened is that he exceeded all possible expectations for recovery from multiple opportunistic infections. But this was HIV in the 90s, and so it was very clear that he was not going to survive, as HIV is survivable today. And he enrolled in hospice, and he really received what I believe is sort of top quality hospice care in this country. He just, from the volunteer services to the medical services to making sure that his medical needs were met and his pain needs were met. It was top-notch care. But at the same time, his pain remained uncontrolled, and his symptoms were intolerable to him. And he was really balancing the challenges of not wanting to be medicated until unconsciousness and experiencing what was going on, but really having the pain be controlled. And he was actually a very spiritual individual. He was a choir director at his church, and he very much was very interested in thinking about what was going on with him spiritually and what was the meaning of his life, his death, his relationship to his God. All of those things were very important to him. And he really wanted to have the hospice chaplain there and his clergy there with him at the end of life. But it was really balancing this pain. And he begged his family to kill him. And I just say that just right out. I just say that he said, with all these things that were going on, excellent quality healthcare, excellent quality hospice care, really, digging into his spiritual needs at the end of life and his love for his family, which was very strong. He begged his family to kill him because his symptoms could not be controlled with modern medicine. And if you think back to that doctor saying, "I will keep you alive as long as you want to." The problem is when the patient, John, who was my husband at the time, when he no longer wanted to be alive because this disease was devastating his body and devastating him, the end wasn't near. And what came later was really bad and very, very, very difficult. And, that story is really why I'm here today, because I think it is so compelling that he very much had the best quality care that he could have, and still his symptoms remained uncontrolled. And he was dying, and what he wanted was to be able to control the timing and manner of his death. And it was so bad that he asked his wife, me, to kill him. And that was an action I was not willing to do. I did not do, but it did bring me to where we are today. So that's my patient story number one. It's a very personal one. If you meet people who are active in the Death with Dignity field like I am, many of them have personal stories to share with you about dying experiences, some good, some difficult, some very challenging, like John's story. but I just am pleased to share that for you, to show you the passion behind what I do. So going back into my more academic world, how death with dignity works. So I've talked about these underlying concepts like self-determination and autonomy, and I've talked about principles like a medical standard of care. But really, how does this work? And I'm mostly going to talk about Oregon, and throughout the rest of my presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about Oregon. But you should know that each of the Death with Dignity statutes in the United States is based on the Oregon law, and they're almost identical. And so what I'm telling you, if I talk about Oregon, it's practically the same in every state. So how it works, a patient makes a request to a physician and no other person can make the request. Again, this is a patient-driven process. The physician determines the patient is terminally ill with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. If the patient does not meet that prognosis, then they don't qualify. The patient must then go through a 15-day waiting period after they make the oral request to the physician. And they must also in that time seek a second opinion. And that second opinion, that second doctor, who is called the consulting physician in the law, must confirm the terminal diagnosis and prognosis. So if this second physician determines that the person is not terminally ill within 6 months, then they can't qualify. After this second opinion, the patient must submit a written request, which is witnessed by 2 individuals. And then both the attending and the consulting physician must meet with the patient and have a clinical visit or 2 or 3, and must determine the patient is capable of making healthcare decisions. And if either physician, so either the attending or the consulting physician, believes that there's depression or mental illness or dementia or some other condition that is impairing this person's ability to make healthcare decisions, the patient has to be referred to a mental health assessment. And if that mental health assessment determines the patient is not capable of making healthcare decisions, the process stops. So again, it's very important in the Death with Dignity Acts to make sure that there's no mental illness going on, no depression, no dementia that is impacting a person's ability to make healthcare decisions. This is a very important part of the law. And so both physicians who are involved in the case have to determine that there's no impairment in health care decision making. And if there's any question, the person has to be referred to a third mental health professional, a psychiatrist, psychologist, or a social worker with extended end-of-life care experiences to make the determination that the person is capable of making healthcare decisions. So say the person makes it all the way through that process. They've made their first request orally. They have met the standard of a terminal illness with a 6-month time frame, a 6-month prognosis by both the attending and consulting physician. Both the attending and consulting physician believe that the patient is mentally competent. The patient writes a written request, and then what happens, and it goes through the waiting period, and then there is another oral request that the patient has to make. After all of those steps, and they're almost, again, identical in almost all the jurisdictions, so there's plenty of safeguards built into it. After all of those pieces to become qualified, the attending physician writes a prescription for a medication to hasten death, which the patient may or may not fill based on their choice. So typically, 1/3 of individuals who qualify do not ingest the medication. They go on to die of their underlying condition. The medication simply provides them peace of mind that if it gets bad enough, if the dying process or their pain are so uncontrolled, they have the option to ingest the medication if they choose to hasten their death. So how it works from a physician perspective. That was pretty much the patient perspective. And again, I talked about the Death with Dignity Act. If you just opened it up and looked at it, you'd have kind of one set is the patient, one is the physician. Again, physicians may choose to participate or not. So if you're a physician and your patient comes to you and requests a hasten death, the physician may say, nope, I'm not interested in doing that. And that is, it's done. Then the physician doesn't have to do anything else. The healthcare system may choose to participate or ban the practice in their facility. So an entire healthcare institution may choose to participate or not. Typically, the Catholic healthcare institutions, which provide so much good quality care to individuals living in the United States and frequently end-of-life care through the hospice programs, most, if not all, of the Catholic affiliated healthcare systems have opted out and banned the practice in their facility, which is allowed under the Death with Dignity Acts all across the country. And again, I'll just sort of reiterate, the Death with Dignity legislation is a written standard of care guiding physician practice and protecting the physician, just like any other standard of care in medicine, that, to be protected from malpractice or tort claims, you have to follow the standard of care. And if you do that, you're protected. If not, then no, you're not protected. And again, I'll go back to this idea that this shines a bright light on the practice in the United States. I'll repeat, we know that physicians in every state help patients die every day. They hasten death and they respond to a patient or a family's plea to end the suffering. This does happen, and it's not exceedingly rare. But what the Death with Dignity Act does is it shines a light. It provides a state sanction, a state oversight of this process, so that there are guidelines for a physician to follow. Also, I just wanted to have a nod to informed consent, because informed consent is a very important piece in the Death with Dignity Act. A patient or a physician must inform the patient of all treatment options for the patient's underlying condition. So say someone has pancreatic cancer, which is a common underlying condition that people would use Death with Dignity for, because it leads to uncontrolled suffering and a great deal of pain. The physician must inform the patient of all treatment options for that underlying condition. So there could be quite a few. And the patient must talk to the physician must talk to the patient about what will happen if they ingest the life-ending medication. This is really important. When we take a medication, we need to know what happens. So the physician must talk to the patient about that. The physician must counsel the patient to talk to their family members or tell their family members that they're going to do it. The patient doesn't have to, but the physician must counsel the patient to do that. The physician must confirm that the patient is not acting out of coercion or being forced to use the law. Some states have much stricter guidelines on that. In California, for instance, the physician and patient have to meet alone with not anybody else in the room. But very much the physician is responsible for making sure that the patient is not being coerced or being forced to use the law. And the physician must meet all informed consent process standards that are part of the standard of care in medicine. So the Oregon Death with Dignity Act and all the Death with Dignity Acts spell out pieces of informed consent, but also anything that is part of informed consent in the standard of care of medicine must be followed. So again, to review kind of the qualification process, we have a diagnosis of terminal illness with a prognosis of less than 6 months by 2 separate physicians. Both physicians must determine the patient is mentally competent to make healthcare decisions. Folks must be a resident of the state. And generally that's defined by the state legislature and confirmed by a physician. The person has to be adult, make 3 requests, 2 oral and 1 written, and go through waiting periods. Sometimes there's a 15-day and a 48-hour. Sometimes there's just the 15-day, but the waiting periods. So again, diagnosis, prognosis, mental health competency, residency, being an adult, 3 different requests and 2 different waiting periods. That's the qualification process. And so that's all of the standards or the safeguards that are built into the law. So just going through a patient's story again, I just want to share a story of a patient that I worked with, I think about a year ago at this time. And he was in Portland here in an assisted living facility. And his name was Jasper. Wasn't born in the United States, but was a citizen. And he was 79. He was really not very healthy. When I met him, he had metastasized spine, liver, lung, probably brain. I didn't look at his medical chart, and he was unable to move. He was confined to his bed because the spinal and bones or cancer was really had really eaten away at his pelvic girdle, so he was sort of unable to move. And he wanted death with dignity, and he didn't really have the words for it. But he did want his physician to help him die. He was very clear about those words. And the challenge his mental status was unclear to me. And again, I'm not a consulting physician, so I don't have to make this determination, but I am an advocate. But it was clear to me that this patient, I was not sure that he was going to qualify. But I did just want to sit with him. And so I sat and listened to him, and his wife had died, and his child had died too. So he was pretty alone. And what I learned was that he had pretty uncontrolled pain. And what was happening was that he was backing off of his pain medication so that he could, be engaged and talk to me. And then, taking it because it was so bad, because metastasized spine, liver, lung cancer is really painful. It can be incredibly painful. And so he was just going in and out of this kind of semi-consciousness and consciousness to really advocate for himself. And so I, in my role, he talked to the physician, and the physician, made the determination that there was a possible question of competency, the same thing that I had wondered about, and referred the patient for a mental health assessment. And during that time, I really talked to him about what he wanted. His death with dignity, his choice, but what are his other choices? And really what I learned was he wanted his pain to be better controlled, which makes sense, right? That's probably what most of us want. But it was, again, this challenge of being medicated to, unconsciousness or, being awake. And so really worked with his current physician. So he's going through the death with dignity process of getting a mental health evaluation. And then also kind of trying to control his pain and manage where he was living and how he wanted to die. Really helped him have a voice in the assisted living facility about what was going on with his medication and when he wanted to, be more sedated and when he wanted to be awake but tolerate the pain. And when we hit that balance, we hit that right sort of pain control balance, he stopped being interested in death with dignity. And I call that a success, right? I just call that a success because he had this option. He considered this option. We really advocated for a whole host of options and came down to what he really wanted to do and what he really needed to live the rest of his days. And that's why I think this is a death with dignity success story. It has nothing to do with death with dignity. He didn't advance through the process. The safeguards worked, but he got the dying that he wanted. So switching gears again, I have one more patient story that's lighter and faster at the end. I just want to talk about the policy process. So I talked about the physician steps, the patient steps, what death with dignity is, where it is. So death with dignity has been legal since 1994 in Oregon, where it was passed on the ballot, and it's the first of its kind in the world legislation. So we in the United States, there's a handful of jurisdictions in the country that allow physician-assisted dying, physician-hastened death. Some allow euthanasia. So there's countries around the world that allow that. We have the most narrow and the most constrained legislation of its type in the world. So Oregon's law was groundbreaking. And it remains to be today. And to today, we have the most narrow and most constrained, again, legislation in the world. It's legal in Washington as of 2008. In Montana in 2009, there was a judicial order at the state Supreme Court determining that physicians could not be prosecuted under their constitution for prescribing a hastened death. So it's legal in Montana by judicial order. Vermont was the first legislature to pass in 2013, California in 2015, Colorado in 2016 by the ballot. The District of Columbia passed in 2016 through the city council process. Hawaii passed in 2018 through the legislative process. And just last year, both Maine and New Jersey passed the law in their state legislature. So 9 codified or, put into law pieces of death with dignity, 1 by judicial order in Montana. So the next steps, what are the next states that we see? The next states are the likelihood of passage is Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona. So that sort of west/southwest arena is really been very active for a long time and is really pushing toward death with dignity. We see Maryland has been active for about 6 years and is very close to passage. And also New York and Massachusetts are the big jurisdictions that are looking at death with dignity that I see in the next few years. 2021 is going to be a hard legislative year to call, clearly, with all of the things that are going on in our world, but very much death with dignity is coming to New York and Massachusetts. It's just a matter of when. So polling, it seems like a controversial issue, but the reality is that Americans support death with dignity. Death with dignity has demonstrated majority support in the United States in polling since the 1970s. Gallup, for instance, so let me tell you the question that Gallup asked. It has asked this question every 2 to 3 years since 1947. Right, so it's tracked. We have the polling data about death with dignity since 1947, and it says, when a person has a disease that cannot be cured, do you think doctors should be allowed to end the patient's life by some painless means if the patient and his or her family request it? And that current support, the latest poll, 2018, 72%. So when a person has a disease that cannot be cured, do you think that doctors should be allowed to end the patient's life by some painless means if the family and his or her, or the patient and his or her family request it? 72%. So again, you can question the validity of polls, that's legitimate, but the reality is it's the same question has been asked since 1947, and support looks like this. It started at about 43%, 40%, I think. It hit majority support in the 70s and is currently at 72%, sort of is tapering off at that 72, 73, 74%. Similarly, the Harris poll, which has asked this question for a very long time, national polling data, less frequently than Gallup, but kind of over time, Harris poll found, and the most recent one they did is 2014, 74% of American adults believe that terminally ill patients who are in great pain should have the right to end their lives. Only 14% were opposed, and that was up from 70%, so 70 to 74% between 2011 and 2014. Again, 2 different polling firms, different methodologies really come to the same conclusion that support for death with dignity hovers around the 70% line. So it's very, very much supported by individuals in the United States. When I travel the country speaking, which I do, overwhelmingly, people tell me they support this. I'm in the airport, people ask me what I do, I tell them what I do. They're very supportive. It just is around the country. And again, this is a nonpartisan issue. I have supporters who run the gamut from, NRA folks to libertarians, sort of government out of my backyard, to the most progressive progressives that you can see in the United States. And I have supporters who come up to me from all walks of life. This is not a partisan issue. We all die. We all have opinions about how we die. And so, and that's why I think that the polling is at the 70% that it's at. 70 million people live in a state allowing medical aid in dying. 70 million. So this is very much a proposal that is supported. State medical societies. So typically, organized medicine, the AMA, has been opposed to death with dignity, but the state level medical societies are moving so much now from a position of opposed to neutrality. And when we poll physicians, we see a majority of physician support on the issue. So very much. Sometimes the opposition to death with dignity uses physicians as the face of opposition. It's not true, actually. It is very much not true. The majority of physicians support this. And one of the things that just to think about in terms of support is we think about this as a sort of a contested political issue, but patients are resolute. Right? If this option is one for them, and very few people choose death with dignity, but for those they do, there's very little hesitation. Again, these folks are resolute. They know what they want. So in terms of implementation, what do we know about implementation in Oregon? And again, I'm going to talk about Oregon statistics, just a little bit statistics, but they're the same almost across the nation in states that have death with dignity laws, kind of based on their population. So if you think about from 1998 to 2019, 21 years of writing prescriptions in Oregon, only 2,518 prescriptions have been written the entire time that death with dignity has been legal in the state. So this is a very rarely used option. 1,657 Oregonians have ingested a legal prescription dose of medication and died due to the Death with Dignity Act. So just 1,650 people in 21 years. So this is a very rarely used option at the end of life. 51.9 deaths per 10,000 in the state in 2019. The Oregon Health Department estimates 51 out of 10,000 deaths are death with dignity. So what's the median age? Is 72. So what do participants look like? 96% of them are white. Oregon has an overwhelming white majority, but this is very much more than that. Again, the median age is 72 with a range of 25 to 102, but very much at the higher end of the range. Folks tend to be well educated. 43% had at least a baccalaureate degree. Overwhelmingly, this is a disease about cancer. 75.1%. It's also a disease about soft tissue cancers. That's sort of like you have to dig down into the data, but those cancers tend to be painful, difficult to manage, even with the best quality medical care, the best quality hospice care. 8% of folks had ALS, so that's a common underlying condition. Very few are 18 to 34 years old, so very much death with dignity mirrors a population of individuals who would have a terminal illness, most likely from cancer. So only 0.6% of them were 18 to 34, as opposed to 15.8% are over 85. It's split between women and men, 53% women, 47% men, but again, that's a split. Folks were well insured. So this is not an issue where people don't have insurance or don't have a way to pay for care. 98.8% of folks using the Death with Dignity Act had some form of health insurance. So again, they're getting good quality care. 92.6% died at home. So it's a very high rate of home deaths. This is very much about dying at home. 90.2% were enrolled in hospice. So again, some folks say that this is hospice or death with dignity. Not the case. This is hospice and death with dignity. So again, this is not a vulnerable group of individuals that doesn't have a way to pay for their health care and is not receiving good quality end-of-life hospice care. That is not the case. This is very much a group of people who are insured and are getting their end-of-life care needs met through hospice. And this is across the board in multiple states that have death with dignity, just not in Oregon. So I just want to kind of close on a patient story. I just want to talk a little bit about Gladys and her family. And this is kind of my story and my boss's story. Early in my career at Death with Dignity, when I was sort of jumping to a policy person, but really wanted to know how the process worked, because I'd, again, lived in Iowa, which is a non-death with dignity state. And I went to visit a colleague, and this colleague had been working with patients for about 10 years and working with folks who requested assisted dying and meeting with them. And I really didn't know what to expect. Kind of, I knew it academically, but I've been around people who are dying all the time through my work in hospice and other ways as a social worker, but I didn't know what to expect with this. And I was kind of shocked, I think, to find a room full of people and it's kind of surrounding the hospital bed in the living room as we see, with the lift chair in the living room, which we see. But Gladys, the matriarch, was in bed, and she was very old, and she was very physically frail, but she was very much in control of the room. And I met lots of people and realized that she had invited her family in because she was dying, right? And her kids and her grandkids and folks were there. And George, my colleague, stepped on her oxygen hose for a minute. I mean, there's just so many people. There's kind of chaos everywhere, controlled chaos. And she laughed kind of from the corner, and she said, "So that's how you do it. It's the oxygen." And George was standing on the oxygen hose, and he didn't realize that what was going on, but he quickly did. And it was just funny. He's like, "That's how you do it." And it just seemed like a very natural gathering of her family members. And suddenly, like this experience of being with folks who are dying in other places, not using death with dignity, where they have gathered their family members around and they're imparting wisdom and making meaning of their life, right? That's our job at the end of life, as we really deal with our spirituality, our mortality, what's the meaning of our life, what do we mean to our children and our family and our loved ones? And I just knew that room was full of love. And what I knew is that death with dignity is about life. It's not about death. It was about that life that was in that room. And I just realized at that time that death with dignity is just life affirming, and it was such an honor to spend that time with Gladys and her family, and death with dignity was the right choice for her. And she was dying, but she was going to control the timing and manner of her death. And there is just nothing that I could not have been prouder to help her have that choice. So with that, I think I will end this conversation with you all. I hope you've learned a little bit. If you have any questions, your conference conveners can help you reach out to me. But again, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will perhaps see you another time. Bye-bye.
Break. I mean, a little break. We'll be back in 3 minutes. Hurry.
Hello again. It's my task today to introduce Father Thomas Curran, who will explain the Roman Catholic teaching regarding medical assistance in dying. It is an easy task indeed, since Father Curran has requested only a 2-sentence introduction, and since anything more begins to sound too much like an obituary. I told him I would honor his wishes, but anyone who wants to know more about him can find it on our website. So here's my introduction. Thomas Curran is a Jesuit priest in the Central and Southern Province Society of Jesus. He became the 14th president of Rockhurst University in 2006. Father Curran.
Good morning. Thank you, Steve. It's good to be with you. Be assured that all of us are practicing good social, safe distancing, but I wanted to keep my mask on, but now I'm at a distance where I can remove the mask to be less muffled and to be amongst you. Again, thank you, Steve. I truly am of the opinion these long introductions, I've said, as we've all experienced them, and when I've been introduced that way myself, I often come up and say, okay, now that you've heard the obituary, here's the body. A little bit of Funeral Consumer Alliance humor, I guess. It is an honor and privilege to be with you, and I greatly appreciate it. The introductory comments, our opening presentation from Peg, where she really captured it as, let this to be about a conversation. And so I am here to provide another piece to that conversation, the Roman Catholic perspective. I do not see this as an opportunity to convince. This is an opportunity for us to enrich one another with this conversation. So my presentation, I am going to use a PowerPoint, but I assure you it is a brief PowerPoint because we have all experienced that, what I call death by PowerPoint, right, where the PowerPoints just go on and on and on. There's only 7 of them, 7 slides here, but making these available for you to go back and look at this. First, a comment just about language and what we're talking about. So even the word euthanasia, I think it's worth considering that how we use it today and the word it means, right? So today it is used more often as what, assisted suicide, but in fact the word itself comes from the Greek. The roots of it, eu and thanatos, it means good and gentle death. So, and I think that's what we really are all about, right? So maybe the language and sometimes is used as a way that's understood in a pejorative way, but I think we all share in that. We are all desiring and we're all about a good and gentle death. So the Catholic position, if I may have that next slide here. How timely to having our conference. So literally just within the last 2 months, the Catholic community, the worldwide Catholic community, issued the Samaritanis bonus. Of course, everything that comes out of Rome always is in Latin and then translated into dozens of languages. This document, which is really a letter that came from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which is the teaching arm of the church. So a little bit of just brief background on this. This was signed off on by the Pope in the summer, this past summer, and then it became an official statement. It is the most recent statement on this issue. So if we're looking for something current, I don't think we could have anything more current. This literally was just issued in September. This is, again, the teaching arm of the church, this doctrine of the faith, and just one little paragraph here, one little section that really you can read there on the screen what that is, but there's just some phrases that really speak to just the whole theme of this, the emphasis of it, and it is these phrases, right? We must know how to stay, how to keep vigil with, and how to abide with. So that's really the approach of this, is how are we staying with those who are dying? How are we keeping vigil with those who are dying? And how are we abiding with them? So that's the recurring theme of this whole document. Next slide, if I may. So in every statement that comes from the Roman Catholic Church, it always begins with what they call the signs of the times, reading the signs of the times. So they basically, what's the situation which we find ourselves at this time? So the signs of the time, they really say that there's 4 things that we're really looking at, this notion of what is quality of life, what is this notion of compassion, notion of individualism, and this experience of a throwaway culture. So obviously there are more, but they're the 4 major signs of the times that we're looking at, all right, in terms of this duty, if you will. And it is really to be seen as a duty to accompany someone, a duty of companionship. And we must confront these circumstances, this quality of life. What does it mean to have a quality of life? The notion of dignity. Human dignity is essential in Catholic teaching, Catholic social teaching. Human dignity, which is given through one's created status. So we recall the Hebrew Scriptures, first book of the Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26, 27, are created in the image and likeness of God. And so we believe we are created in the image, and then we collectively as a community work on becoming more God-like in our time here on earth. It is in light of that the dignity of life always remains. It's not like you get more dignity. Dignity must be upheld at every stage of life. And so we have this notion of a consistent ethic of life, or a seamless garment sometimes is, so that we must be pro-life at every stage, from conception through natural end of life. And at each of those stages, the dignity must be upheld. So one never loses the dignity. You were given that dignity by God, and it's not something you lose, but rather it is something that we as a community must make sure that we always uphold the dignity of life. Even for those who have committed some sort of crime, if you will, maybe a heinous crime, and we sentence to death. Catholic Church is opposed to that because one never loses one's dignity, and you must always be in circumstances to uphold the dignity of that life. So that's the first piece. The dignity is always remains. Secondly, compassion. Compassion, the word compassion, again, back to the roots of the words, pater from the Latin, it means to suffer with. Compassion is to suffer with. Good working definition I always like to use for compassion is a willingness to enter the chaos. A willingness to enter the chaos. So when you say someone is a person of compassion, what a great description, right? To say they're really willing to enter the chaos. And so we need to be compassionate to others, compassionate in circumstances which we find ourselves, and even in our own lives. We must be willing to enter the chaos. That's different from resolving an issue. A person of compassion is not necessarily the hero, but a person of compassion is someone who suffers with because we believe that God suffers with us, and so we do this in accompaniment. So this false understanding of compassion, of a euthanasia as it's understood today, is that, and we rather think of it as, no, you must fully embrace the sick and accompany them. Again, remember, abiding with, staying with, keeping vigil with. So those recurring themes of that. It also confronts this whole issue of individualism, this notion that we're on our own. No, we come into the community And we remain in this, and it's always in a communal experience. So we collectively have responsibility for one another from conception through natural end of life. And then this fourth piece of that notion of, well, one's value has been diminished because you are no longer a contributing member of the community, or you can't contribute as you once did. That's confronted, saying a sick person, well, they're not contributing. Even the person who's sick is feeling, well, I'm not pulling my weight, right? And we're asked to confront that, that it's erroneous to think that you don't contribute anymore because you're contributing differently. So those four circumstances, signs of times, are which this statement is made in, this notion of dignity always remains, compassion, suffering with, true, genuine compassion. Individualism is confronted and kind of challenged, and this notion of a throwaway culture. So after each document first says, here are the signs of the times, then the next piece is, what are the principles we're going to look at? So the next slide here is, all right, if there are the signs of the times, so what are the principles then in which we are going to address these circumstances in which we find ourselves? And the principles are, and they draw from something that was a recurring theme in the writings of St. John Paul II, a pontiff, a pope who served for 26 years, and a line that he said repeatedly: to cure if possible, but always to care. To cure if possible, but always to care. And so the care should never end. And incurable is not the same, therefore, as uncurable. So, well, that person has an incurable disease. Well, okay, an incurable disease, or I have an incurable disease, but that doesn't mean that I am uncurable. The next piece, again, I've stated this already, is true compassion. True compassion, and again, back to the understanding of the word compassion, to suffer with, right, consists not in causing death, but being a companion. I walk with, I support you, and I accompany you in this whole process. And again, then this recurring theme of individualism, we must confront this notion of you're on your own, this kind of strong, kind of bravado approach to this. No, we do. Am I my brother, my sister's keeper? Yes. Yes, we are responsible for one another. There's a communal experience. We are born into a community, and we are to be seeing one another as my sisters and my brothers. You know, the beloved community, even that John Lewis spoke of, right? And we're hearing more. That's truly rooted in the scriptures. I need, and I cherish seeing you as my sister and my brother. Therefore, in this community, and we've had the experience of someone being in our community, this person of Jesus Christ, who called us to this beloved community, thinking of even his death, what? A mutually compassionate gaze at the foot of the cross, looking down upon his mother and this beloved disciple, and they, in turn, this gaze back. And so there literally is an accompaniment of this Jesus at the cross. It really is this notion of being with, keeping vigil with, staying with. So it's a scriptural example of how we're then going to concern ourselves and look at these signs of the times. All right, so first, looking at the situation we find ourselves, right, what they call the signs of the times. Second is the principles. And then we go to what is our actual teaching. So the next slide here. So what are the actual things, the teaching components here that we look at? Well, euthanasia, as we understand the word today, it's a crime against human life for the Catholic community. All right, it is intrinsically evil. When we say intrinsically, and that word is used in a lot of the teachings of the church, intrinsically, meaning it's never justified. It can never, well, is this exception? No, it's intrinsically, meaning it's always wrong. never morally justified, never permitted, all right? And formal or material cooperation, meaning that I bring it about or I am willing to be a part of that, that's considered a sin. That's considered an offense to be a part of that, and we name that as such. And those approving such laws, we consider our accomplices in that. It's not a judgment. It's just we're saying it as a in our teaching, in our community. That's the way we look at that. Now, what about the one, and Peg spoke so eloquently, so thoughtfully, and such just incredible compassion in the voice there of truly someone who suffers with and is accompanied with. So what about the one who says, I wish to bring this to closure? Well, there's not this notion in this teaching that, well, no, you suck it up. No, that's not. In fact, there's several statements there saying, look, let's look with great compassion and great empathy upon the one who's requesting this. And recognizing the amount of pain, the amount of discomfort, the amount of emotional trauma for this, it truly can reduce his or her responsibility in terms of this personal suffering, recognizing. So let's not just look at this in a mechanical fashion or just, you're being weak here. No, it's not saying that. So it is trying to really show great empathy for this person. And how do they describe it? They say, here's an anguished plea of love and hope. Someone saying, I need help. And so in that request for help, we as a community are to be there, again, to abide with, to keep vigil with, to accompany. Right? So it's never, no, you do this on your own or expected to do it on your own. A couple of other pieces to that. This is the next slide. So how does this shake out, if you will, in terms of, well, okay, what does the treatment look like? What do we allow? What do we sign off on, if you will? Well, truly, one can reject treatments that provide only a painful extension of life. If truly we're talking about, well, we're going to do this just to prolong your pain, well, no, I can rule that out as a patient. I'm not expected to just, you need to suffer a little more. No, that's rejected. But at the same time, there can be no interruption of those things that one is still benefiting from. So hydration, food, if there is still benefiting the person, that needs to be provided. Now, if it's neutral in terms of it's not doing anything, then okay, then that can obviously be revisited and reconsidered. And then what about palliative care? Palliative care is precious. It's a crucial instrument with which, again, to accompany the patient, but it cannot be an instrument. In other words, it cannot advance. It must be an instrument of accompaniment, not an instrument of advancement. So that's the difference between, well, I'm talking about palliative care. Okay, so as we evaluate this palliative care here, is it an instrument of accompaniment or is it an instrument of advancement? Catholic community would say, if it's truly an instrument that advances, then we will take objection to this. And then lastly, some comments about this notion of accompaniment, the last slide here. So community here I've spoke about. So what about the members of the community? Well, what about this family? So the family and friends. So there needs to be, the statement is very, very clear, there needs to also be support for the family. This whole notion of what? Care for the caregivers. They need help too. They need resources. And so Peg had talked about the Catholic community and Catholic hospitals kind of opting out of this legislation. So, okay, you can't just opt out. You also need to say, well, okay, what are you providing then as alternatives? How are you accompanying? Well, we need to fulfill our responsibility of accompaniment to make sure the resources are there. It's just not saying, oh, it's unfortunate, that's sad. There truly must be resources made available for the family as well. So what about the prenatal, pediatric cases? Oh my heavens, to even think about this for a child. Well, they should be not left without assistance. Again, They must be accompanied. So that word just dozens and dozens of times of this notion of accompaniment. And even the word accompaniment, right? We know compon, companion. Com means with, pon means bread. Nothing more intimate than to gather at the table, to break bread with someone. So when you say someone is truly a companion with you, you sit at the table with them, you converse with them, you feed one another, you nourish one another, you support one another, you are with one another, you abide with one another, you keep vigil with one another, you do not abandon one another. And then this notion of some terms such as a vegetative state. Patient has the right, again, to food and hydration, but, and this is a moral principle here, the disproportionality. If it's disproportionate and it actually causes excessive burden and it's not effective, then it can be discontinued. So it's not just, well, we're just going to continue to hydrate. No, if it's disproportionate and it's not, then that's evaluated as such and that's discontinued. Deep sedation, possibility? Again, if it's accompaniment, yes. If it's an advancement, no. And have their what? It cannot directly and intentionally cause death, but it can be used to provide possible peace and that possible peace might reduce that level of stress and then actually allow that person to pass. That's certainly acceptable. But again, if deep sedation is a measure of accompaniment versus advancement, then yes, that is acceptable. And lastly, what about those who are in the medical profession, health providers, health professionals, and they are people of faith? Is there any sort of carve out or consideration for them? So if we have care or concern for the one who is suffering and the families who accompany him, well, there's also members of this community, the medical personnel who accompany. And what if I am not, if I am medical personnel and if I am in fact at an institution that does not uphold these and does allow for assisted suicide? What recourse do I have? Well, the statement says very clearly, if euthanasia is allowed by law in a region, in a state, in a jurisdiction, those objecting should be allowed to witness the values the church possesses with them, professes with them. There should be a carve out, and basically there should be an effort for them, an allowance for them to object on the grounds of their conscience. So I hope that from what I've shared and the slides I've given is kind of a quick summation of, like I said, the most recent and the most up-to-date statement of the faith that comes from the place from which our statements of faith come from, the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. And again, great honor and pleasure to be with you, and thank you for allowing me this opportunity to accompany you and to be a part of this conversation that we collectively abide with, keep vigil with, and accompany one another. Peace.
Hello, my name is Jackie Amwig, and I serve as a secretary for Funeral Consumer Alliance of Greater Kansas City. And I first became involved after I attended one of Sally King's presentations and became more informed about the work of Funeral Consumer Alliance and the great work that is done. So I'm here to introduce our next speaker. Reverend Bowers is an ordained minister, a chaplain, and a spiritual director. She has a passion for empowering informed and life-giving choices at every stage of life. She has served Presbyterian, United Church of Christ, and Unity churches in California and in Missouri. She's been a hospice chaplain since 2006. And that's where I first met her, our work together at Kansas City Hospice and Palliative Care. She's a member of Spiritual Directors International. She's a member of Heartland Presbytery, Missourians to Abolish the Death Penalty, and the League of Women Voters. She's on the leadership team for Faith and Grief Ministries and a member of Contemplative Fire Spiritual Community. Reverend Bowers has 3 grown children and 2 grandchildren. She's an avid reader, an animal lover, and a group facilitator. And it's my privilege to introduce you today to Melissa Potts Bowers.
Good morning. I have to confess that I'm humbled and a little intimidated to be joining a group like Father Thomas and Dr. Lantos and the amazing Manaj Shabir, but I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm very grateful to all of our colleagues who work in healthcare, whom I know bring your heart as well as your great clinical skills to the work that you do, and who make the effort every day to bring the best of your own faith tradition, or to respect the fact that you may or may not be a person of faith, but you have a keen ear and an open heart to the faith concerns of our patients. And so as we take a look at religion and how it intersects with medical aid in dying, I want to thank you for your commitment to maintaining that integrity and that compassion and care. I've got a really big task today to do in a short period of time. So I've been asked to address the perspective of Protestants on medical aid in dying. And so unlike some of our other faith traditions that tend to be more unified in perhaps their groups or their polity, I'll just go ahead and say Protestants are all over the place. And so Protestants tend to be defined in one of 2 major ways. Sometimes Protestants are defined as faith traditions that come out of Reformed or Anabaptist type theologies, and then other people define Protestants as all Christians who are not Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox. So you had a pretty broad stroke. So today I'm going to be honoring that broad stroke and then also really encourage you to research, as there is so much on the internet, and you will probably be able to find information in regards to your particular patient's religious background. I want to briefly address the purpose of religion. Religion is all about reframing our perspectives from what we want, or maybe what our family wants, or what our physician advises, or even the protocols of medical care facilities and policies, back to one's relationship with a higher power, with the divine, or with God, however that person expresses their relationship with the divine. And so when religion comes into the picture in regards to healthcare or medical aid in dying, the focus really sharpens on the patient's relationship with God and really softens on the relationship with family and community and physicians. That becomes very secondary. So we're going to then focus on what we need to know to really help persons take a look at decisions like medical aid in dying in a way that would be most helpful to them. So first of all, I'm going to start on the right and move to the left. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm being very general here, and whenever we generalize, we are on swampy ground, and we're going to be wrong somewhere. So when you face your own patient and family, you can really drill that down to what their religious and faith background looks like. On the more conservative side, we tend to have a few mainline Protestant denominations, the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and the Episcopal Church have tended to say that generally human beings do not have the right to take any act that actively ends life. And so their perspective is that withdrawing support is okay when a patient can no longer intake food or water, and allowing what they would call a natural death is okay, but that we cannot intervene and actively end life, which they're defining as physical life. That's interesting that in some cases statements have been made that say the use of pain medication is okay, even if it might hasten the end of life. So that seems a little gray to me, but still that statement was found as I researched some of these more conservative viewpoints. Evangelicals also tend to be conservative, and again, that's a really broad swath. A lot of evangelicals fall into a denominational umbrella, and some not. Some of them are non-denominational groups that come together. They also tend to embrace the same statement that human beings are not allowed, from a spiritual, religious perspective, to actively take a life by the use of medication, but again, that it's okay to withdraw life support. Interestingly, among evangelicals, their leaders of non-white evangelical churches are sometimes a little more forward in talking about how their cultural context and their historical context of the United States influences that. For instance, Reverend William Lamar, who is an American Methodist Episcopal pastor in Washington, D.C., said, "The reason I oppose medical aid in dying is the deep history of malfeasance when it comes to the United States and the medical establishment. Lack of commitment to caring equally for bodies that are not white has a deep history in the United States." He continues and says, "I feel like it's my responsibility to not take at face value things that are said about what we will do and how we will enforce equity, because there are just too many examples of those things not happening." And so again, often from a more a right perspective, tends to be what we would call high theology, and really kind of tuning in and defining God in a certain way, and sharing certain kinds of perspectives. We're still all coming from a context, a social and ethical and ethnic context. And so I really appreciated that Reverend Lamar was willing to step out and to own that and share that. There are other religious groups that we might define as Protestant that fall under this more conservative or right side umbrella that says that humans under no circumstances have any right to end life directly. And they would be groups like Seventh-day Adventists, the Southern Baptist Convention, Jehovah's Witnesses, Church of the Nazarene, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, among others. So again, you see how broadly we're brushing our stroke is here. As we then move towards the middle, there are some mainline groups that tend to be kind of in between what we would call right and left. Those groups are groups like the Quakers, the Presbyterian Church USA, and the United Church of Christ. And as you take a look at their documents, you see that they are recommending a deep engagement with one's spiritual and religious values, a deep engagement with the spiritual community, including their faith leader as a guide, but ultimately point to that relationship being paramount and whether or not it's right, religiously or spiritually, to step into the use of something like medical aid in dying. The Presbyterian Church published a document in 2016 called Abiding Presence, Living Faithfully in the End-of-Life Decisions. And it says, decisions to hasten death may be understandable as a last resort when all connection to one's community has been or will be lost, and medical pain management is no longer effective. So there's a strong focus in these kind of middle Protestant denominations on relationships with the community, relationship with God. In fact, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, which is a political and polity environment that allows medical aid in dying, has published a wonderful document that uses the scripture of the Good Samaritan to embrace this basic question, what does it mean to love my neighbor? And then from that perspective, really walks a person of faith through some of the many things to reflect on in regards to medical aid in dying. So we're moving from the right to the middle, and now we're going to go a little bit more left. On the left are faith communities which tend to emphasize one's personal relationship with God as primary. And so they open the door to personal choice. And again, you're looking at a deep engagement with one's inner values as a guide for making decisions for or against medical aid in dying. And a lot of these groups may or may not identify as Christian, or perhaps they're more quiet about that. So they're not necessarily Protestant, but we didn't have a space for them in today's overview. So I wanted to include them because they are important. They include some groups that may be humanist, pantheist, panentheist, groups like Unitarians, other Universalist groups, New Thought groups like Christian Science, Unity, Science of Mind, and earth-based groups like Pagan and Wiccan. It is worth noting here, I think, that some of our very first medical aid in dying legislation, which happened in the Pacific Northwest, was started and moved forward by groups who had close ties to Unitarian congregations. And they're hosting us today, for which we're very grateful. So overall, among what we would call Protestants, from right to left on that end of the spectrum, you'll see an emphasis in one's viewpoint of God on the right side as being what we would call a very high theological perspective, an emphasis on law and doctrine, and a definition of life as being physical life, life in the body breathing, the heart beating. And then on the other end, you'll find more of what we would call a low theology, more of an emphasis on the relationship between an individual and his or her God, their values, more of an emphasis on mercy than law, a real bringing in of the family and the community and considering everyone who's affected. And then the primacy of life being defined as spiritual life, really rooted in the freedom of belief and choice, not necessarily defined as what's happening with the physical body. There's also a pretty big group in there, which I'll share with you from my years of chaplain experience. I call them SNRs. That stands for spiritual, not religious. And so they have a deep spiritual belief and a relationship with the transcendent, but don't necessarily cast themselves into a religious group. And that group is growing. So as healthcare providers, it's really important for us to become, if you might be in that group, if you're not, to become a little bit more familiar with how they make decisions and find meaning and what's important to them. So I want to share a couple of things in regards to the information I just shared with you. Those perspectives were drawn from statements publicized by religious bodies. And those are different as well. And from some religious perspectives, the lawmaking body of that faith makes a decision, and that decision speaks for all members who claim to be part of that particular faith tradition. Other kinds of polities, especially Protestant polities, will have a central body that makes a decision, and then different synods or regions or congregations will have to individually ratify that decision. So you might go to your research source and see that this particular Protestant denominational body holds this viewpoint, but then find out that your patient in front of you is from a congregation that didn't ratify that. And so they're in another place, polity and policy-wise. So that makes it a little more complicated, but I think it's important for you to know as you work with your patients and try to find out how you can best help them from their religious and spiritual perspective. Also, it's important to note that the statements of denominational bodies do not necessarily speak for individuals, even individuals who are deeply committed to their faith communities. So medical aid in dying is an individual choice. For instance, I opened by sharing with you how many Protestant denominations, in fact, most of them, make a statement that medical aid in dying would not be appropriate under any circumstance according to their polity. And yet, in a 2013 Pew Research poll, it showed that 59% of Protestants are in favor, actively in favor of medical aid in dying type legislation. So there you go. So we are, of course, working with people, real flesh and blood people who have care needs, who may be in pain on all levels, not just physical, but spiritual and emotional as well. And so in that context, we want to remember that the primacy for medical aid in dying is on personal choice. And so we want to help them in that context to reach out and bring in their faith communities in a way that are meaningful for them, but also honor their own choices and their own best destiny, however they may see that. So thank you so much. I'm really grateful that all of you are here today. Thank you.
Hello again. It was 59 years ago that several members of this church, All Souls, Unitarian Universalists here in Kansas City, were concerned enough about the high cost of funerals to organize the Memorial Society of Kansas City to address that problem. They negotiated agreements with a few willing funeral homes to offer discounted prices to its members. That Memorial Society evolved into our organization, the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Greater Kansas City. We're one of 60 affiliates across the nation of the National Funeral Consumers Alliance in Vermont. We have no arrangements with funeral homes for discounts. Instead, we collect and make public the detailed pricing information of all 113 funeral homes in this metropolitan area and surrounding cities. Anyone can access it free of charge on our website. The Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule makes it possible for us to collect all those prices. It requires funeral homes to turn over their general price list to anyone who requests them in person. Most funeral homes cooperated with us by sending their price lists when we requested them, by phone or email, but others did not. That's when, under normal circumstances, our volunteers organized to visit them in person and obtain their price list. We do this every 2 years. It's one of the primary functions of our organization. This year, all but 25 of the funeral homes cooperated with us after being asked once, twice, or 3 times. That's a 78% return rate, and that's not bad. Why didn't the 25% respond? Maybe because their prices were not competitive. We know those with competitive prices want to be listed. Maybe they forgot or were too busy. Maybe because they don't appreciate us butting into their business and telling people what we charge. We live in a death-denying society. We all know we are going to die someday, but it's not something most of us want to think about or plan for. It's one of the greatest challenges of our organization. Often, people are caught unprepared when death claims a loved one. They are emotionally upset. They don't shop for prices. They revert to the funeral home that they used last time, even when they can't afford the prices charged. There are no nonprofit funeral homes in Kansas City, and families are vulnerable. That's why we make a concerted effort to place our price list in the hands of hospices, chaplains, hospitals, pastors, social workers, those who deal with families in time of need. That's why the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth have given grants for several years to our organization because poor people, the main recipients of their work, die too. Their families can easily be drawn into funeral poverty. They and everyone else as well need the information that we have. They need to know which provider charges $3,500 for a standard funeral and which charges over $9,000 for the same services, or which charges $675 for a direct cremation and which charges $3,500 or 5 times more for the same essential service. This year, our spreadsheet master was Board Treasurer David Johnson, a retired accountant. He received the numbers collected by 10 volunteers, and he assembled them number by number. The Funeral Consumers Alliance does not endorse funeral homes. What consumers spend for the funerals of their loved ones is their business. We just try to live up to our mission statement, which is to educate and support families in making informed decisions about death-related services according to their values and lifestyles. Thank you. And now we have another 3-minute break.
Peace is flowing like a river, flowing out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Love is flowing like a river, floating out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Healing's flowing like a river, flowing out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Hope is flowing like a river, flowing out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Justice is flowing like a river, flowing up through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free, setting all the captives free.
Hi, I'm John Lantos, going to talk today a little bit about end-of-life care decisions and practices.
Good morning. I'm Diane Etzelweiss, and I'm the newest board member for the Funeral Consumer Alliance of Kansas City. I'm honored today to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Manaz Shabir. She'll be reflecting on the Muslim perspective. Manaz is president of Shabir Advisors, a management consulting company focusing on planning, marketing, public relations, diversity, transformation, and education nationally and internationally. She serves on the faculty at Park University here in Kansas City, teaching marketing and diversity in patient care delivery for the Masters of Healthcare Leadership Program. Prior to forming her own company, she was vice president for strategic planning and business development at Carondelet Health, a Catholic healthcare system here in Kansas City. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in business administration from the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Sorry, I work at the University of Kansas. I had a little slip up there. University of Missouri in Kansas City, UMKC. Manaz serves on several boards, including the Overland Park Police Board, the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council, Truman Medical Center Board, the Center for Religious Educational Studies, and the Crescent Peace Society. She's also the past president of the Heartland Muslim Council. Manaz has been recognized by a multitude of organizations, including the Kansas City Press Club, the Women's Foundation of Greater Kansas City, YWCA, Church Women United, the ACLU, and the Midland Islamic Council. She was invited to join the International Women's Forum in 2016, received the Interfaith Ambassador Award from the Muslim Journal in 2016, and the Civic Leader of the Year Award from the Mid-America Asian Culture Association in 2018. So if you haven't run across Manaz in any of those capacities, I think you will recognize the next piece. Her article, "I Am an American Muslim Woman," appeared in the Kansas City Star and was syndicated throughout the United States. She has also written articles for Kansas City Voices, Kansas City Jewish Chronicle, and Ingram's Magazine. Her articles are found in national publications such as New Light, the National Catholic Reporter, Boomer Market Advisor, and Chicken Soup for the Soul. Of particular interest to our topic today, Manaz co-authored the chapter on Islam in the Essential Guide to Religious Traditions and Spirituality for Healthcare Providers, which was published in 2013. I'll make sure we put that reference on our website so you can check it there. It's an invaluable resource to all healthcare providers, containing detailed information on faith traditions, vital for providing spiritual care in a clinical setting. Manaz is the mother to 4 Eagle Scouts and a grandmother. She is also a certified tree farmer. Manaz Shabir.
Okay. Thank you, Diane. I did have my obituary there, so. No, it's my pleasure being with all of you. I'm going to greet you all with our traditional Islamic greeting called Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you. It's my pleasure to be with you today to talk about something that a lot of people don't think about until, unfortunately, we get closer and we're dealing with it. But as a Muslim, I have to tell you that we think about death all the time. We think about it every time we go to bed and we put our head down on the pillow, we just don't know if we'll wake up. So we try to live our life as if we're not. And so we're in that conscious state of thinking of death. And when someone passes away in our community, it's like a requirement for us to attend, even if we don't even know the person. And for the men to actually help carry the body to the grave. So we know that one day we will be in the same place. So it's very much with us. And I'm one of the people in our community that do a washing for women who have passed away, and I'm actually on standby right now for someone. And so, again, when we do these participate in these kind of rituals, we know that It'll be a time where somebody will be doing it for us, and we call it the gift that can never be repaid. So I'd like to first start with some basics on Islam and as to how we look at life and death, and then go into the distinction of withholding and withdrawing medical care, and then the Islamic view of medically assistance in dying, and then finally a personal story. So, like in the most faiths, Islam greatly values human life. And Islam is just not a religion, but a way of life. As a Muslim, it's always part of our faith, from before birth to post-death. Every part of one's life is covered in Islam: pre-birth, birth, child rearing, education, marriage, sleeping. I was trying to think of all the things that we do. Eating, health, prayer. There's nothing that's not covered, and that includes illness and dying. And modern medicine has caused some issues. Because as a Muslim, we believe that life and death is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is the Arabic word for God. He has the power over everything, and He is the one who gives and one who takes life. And we know that death is inevitable. And Allah has given us the duty to take care of ourselves. It's our responsibility to be healthy, to do as best as we can, whatever is necessary for survival, and to provide ourselves for treatment. It's part of our duty. It's part of being a Muslim. And during our lifetime, we have tests. Some tests have disappointments. Some tests are failures. And illness is another form of a test. By ending our life early is unacceptable. We have to accept the tests that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us. And as I mentioned before, human life is sacred and very valuable in Islam. One of the basic beliefs in Islam is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all mankind and the real owner of our lives. He's created Adam from mud, and He gave life, and He is the one who started our lives from conception. Therefore, He is the only one who will, in the end, with natural death, at a predetermined time. The moment of death of every creature on this earth is predetermined only by the Creator, and only He knows when this time will come. There are many verses in the Holy Quran, which is our book that we go to. For example, the following verse from the Quran reflects the sanctity of human life. Do not kill yourself, for verily Allah has been to you most merciful. That's in Surah 4, verse 29. And take not life which Allah has made sacred. That also is in the same verse. It's also important to look at the end of life from a Sharia perspective. Now, I know when you hear Sharia, you hear some other connotations there. But let me offer this definition, that Sharia is religious law, just like canon law is for Catholics. So this is how we live our life. Like when we are born, there's certain prayers are said. When we have marriage, these are all part of Sharia. And when we die, there's Sharia as well of how we die. One of the things that is important to know in this conversation is the definition of death. From a medical perspective, the death could occur when the brain stops working, and they call it brain death. But from a Sharia perspective, death occurs when the breathing stops. You don't need a machine to define this. When the heart stops, when death occurs, this is heart death. This brings challenges regarding the life support and medical interventions, all the modern science that has been here, that we all benefit from. And then there's the conversation of withholding care versus withdrawing care. If a patient has a cure, then withholding medical intervention is haram. Haram means against Islamic law. We should do everything that needs to be done. It is wajib. Wajib means required, to save that patient. And suppose a terminal person is revived and put on a machine and is later brain dead. What do we do? Do we remove the respirator? Do we stop the machines? Most religious scholars would say to withdraw the machine is not allowed, even if the doctor says the patient is brain dead. So the distinction is if the machine is helping to cure a patient, then it's haram against Islamic law to withdraw it. If it is just for comfort means for the patient, then it would be possibility for removing the machine. So bottom line, from a Muslim perspective, withholding care is an easier decision than withdrawing care. From a Sharia point of view, if a patient is suffering when there is a cure, then you have to provide care. If the patient is dealing with terminal disease, then the patient or the guardian has to accept care. So let's look at the Muslim perspective on today's topic of medically assistance in dying. There are many verses in the Holy Quran that emphasizes that our lives will end at a fixed, predetermined date, that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows when, and we don't know. Quote, "It is not given to any soul to die, but with the permission of Allah at an appointed time." Surah 3, verse 145. "And no person can ever die except by Allah's leave and at an appointed term." Surah 3, verse 145. These two notions, sanctity of life and that life will end at a time that is predetermined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are two basic beliefs of Islam. So Islam deals with the hastening death as haram against the Islamic faith. There is a belief that the spirit in each one's body does not belong to that person. We are only trusted to take care of it for our time on this earth. So he or she has the duty to preserve and to keep that trust and that spirit. Medically, religious scholars believe that medical assistance in dying is unacceptable in Islam. In all ways, which is forbidden in Islam and considered one of the greatest sins. Voluntary or non-voluntary, direct or indirect, active or passive, all are prohibited in Islam. It is forbidden to end deliberately, by intention, one's life or to hasten the death of any person. Food and fluid are basic human rights and should be provided for every human being, whether one is sick or healthy. Palliative care, hospice, are recommended in Islam, and the best hospice for the Muslim is to die at home naturally with family members around. This is the best dignified death, the best death. Finally, a personal story. My grandmother lived to 102. In fact, her anniversary of her passing was this last week. At the time of her death, which was 15 years ago, her only medication was Robitussin cough medicine and Vicks. Same thing like my fat Greek wedding where they were using Windex, you know. My grandmother believed Vicks cured everything. And 5 almonds. So if you had 5 almonds and Vicks, that took care of everything. Every time I eat almonds, I always think of her. She lived with my uncle and my aunt, who at the time were in their late 70s. They also had home health care to help with her personal care, so my grandmother was bedridden for like 10 years. 6 months prior to her death, she took a turn for the worse and was taken to the hospital. My uncle was her healthcare guardian. It was difficult to find a vein to put an IV in her, and the question came about putting a feeding tube. My uncle decided not to do the feeding tube. It would have been too difficult to manage at home. I remember how I didn't agree with this decision. I was thinking, how can we let her starve to death? But I only shared this with my dad, who was my uncle's brother. My grandmother wasn't talking, but suddenly she said in her room, "When are we going home?" And my uncle responded, "We're going home today." They took her home. They were able to give her nutrition through that thickener. She lived at home for another 6 months and died peacefully. I believe that my uncle did the best thing, and my grandmother had the best death. She never wanted to be bedridden. Who would? But her death was peaceful. I hope what I shared today helps you all to understand the Muslim perspective on today's topic. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Pam Thomas, and I retired from the FCA board in 2019. I am pleased to return and to participate in this interesting and important seminar. I have been asked to introduce Dr. John Lantos, who is currently a professor of pediatrics at the University of Missouri in Kansas City and director of Children's Mercy Hospital Bioethics Center. After his residency at Children's Hospital National Center in D.C., Dr. Lantos served 2 years in the Public Health Service in rural West Virginia and then took a fellowship in clinical medical ethics at the University of Chicago, where he taught for 20 years. He studies and writes about ethical issues in clinical care, in research, and in public policy. He has written 2 books about ethical issues in neonatology and has a forthcoming book on the rise of fetal medicine. Dr. Lantos has served as president of both American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics and the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities. He is currently on the executive committee of the American Academy of Pediatrics section in bioethics. He is also an associate professor of 3 journals: Pediatrics, American Journal of Bioethics, and Perspectives in Biology and Medicine. In the policy arena, he served on President Clinton's Health Reform Task Force and advised the President Bush Council on bioethics about ethical research issues. He is currently co-investigator of a National Human Genome Research Institute-funded grant to study clinical and ethical issues in whole genome sequencing of newborns. In his free time, he plays bass with the in-house Children's Mercy band called the Have Mercies, and he loves to cook. Dr. Lantos.
Hi, I'm John Lantos, going to talk today a little bit about end-of-life care decisions and practices. My goal for today is to go through some information about how people die in the United States today. Then I'm going to give some definitions: palliative care, medical aid in dying, or assisted suicide, what we mean by euthanasia, and distinguish active versus passive and voluntary versus involuntary. And then I hope to spend some time talking about the sometimes fuzzy line between palliative care and euthanasia. Talk about the importance of self-determination, give a little bit of data on how these practices take place both in the United States and around the world. Probably will not get to specific issues around Jewish beliefs, mostly because, although I am Jewish, I'm not an expert in that, and Judaism is so varied and people's beliefs range across the spectrum that I'm not sure it would be helpful. But just to go over sort of basic ideas about how end-of-life decisions are made. This is a graph from a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago that talked about the balance between what they call curative care and what they call palliative care. And the main point of the graph is that these are not either-or options. You can see from these 2 lines, and this is hypothesized for patients who are admitted to the ICU. They're getting curative care all along. They're also getting palliative care all along. Early on in the admission, the balance tilts towards curative care, but depending on their course, they will either get cured or at least improved enough to leave the ICU or not. If it appears that curative care is no longer meeting its goals, then the balance between the two shifts. Curative care is gradually withdrawn. Palliative care increases until the time of death. And for many palliative care doctors today, palliative care continues even after death and through the period of bereavement. This was a study published in JAMA just last year, 2019. It was a survey of almost 70 intensive care units in the United States, just looking at what happened to people who died in ICUs. They looked at whether the family was present, whether the patient was pain-free or delirium-free. What they found is pretty much a wide range, but what I want to focus on for this talk are the two top graphs here. This one shows which patients were extubated prior to death. And what you can see is in over half of the ICUs, most of the patients were taken off a ventilator prior to the time that they died. And then in this other graph, you can also see that most patients do not get CPR in the last hour of life. Both of these reflect decisions, as illustrated on the palliative versus curative care slide, to shift more to a palliative mode as death is approaching. This is important because this didn't used to be the case, but today most patients who die in an ICU or who die in a hospital, or certainly who die out of the hospital, die after a decision has been made to withhold or withdraw some potentially curative or life-prolonging treatment. So discussions are taking place all the time, both among the ICU docs and nurses, between the health professionals and family members, among family members, as decisions are made whether to shift from palliative to from curative to palliative care. And among those decisions are decisions about whether to give medications that may hasten the patient's death. This can be done in a number of ways and goes by a number of names. For example, people have described something called palliative sedation, which has been defined as the monitored use of medications to relieve refractory and unendurable symptoms by inducing varying degrees of unconsciousness, but not death, in patients who, given their disease state, progression, or symptom constellation, are expected to die within hours or days. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I want people to think about sort of some of the subtle distinctions that are being made between this practice, palliative sedation, and active euthanasia or medical aid in dying. In this case, it specifically says the goal is varying degrees of unconsciousness, but not death. But as we will see, sometimes the use of medications to relieve these unendurable symptoms also has the predictable side effect of suppressing breathing, and that may hasten the patient's death. However, this has been legal in the United States long before medical aid in dying. It's practiced widely today and is not considered to be assisted suicide or euthanasia. Medical aid in dying, by contrast, is a practice in which a physician provides a competent terminally ill patient with a prescription for a lethal dose of medication upon the patient's request, which the patient intends to use to end their own life. In this case, the patient has to have both the competence, the mental competence, as well as the physical ability to take the medication themselves. The physician's role is simply to provide that medication. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as the talk goes on. Euthanasia, then, is the act or practice of causing or permitting the death of hopelessly sick or injured individuals, including persons or animals, in a relatively painless way for reasons of mercy. It's also called mercy killing. People have talked about active and passive euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is what those first graphs of practices in the ICU depict. That is, at the bottom here, the act or practice of allowing death by, say, not providing medical treatment or withdrawing life support. Active euthanasia is the act or practice of causing the death of hopelessly sick or injured individuals in a relatively painless way for reasons of mercy, as we already talked about. So what are the legal status of these practices in the United States? Active euthanasia is illegal everywhere in the United States, although, as we'll show, legal in some other countries in the world. Terminal sedation or palliative sedation is legal everywhere. That is, it is considered an appropriate part of palliative care and compassionate end-of-life care. And medical aid in dying or assisted suicide is legal in the states listed here in the District of Columbia, but not in other states, although there are other ballot initiatives that come up periodically, and in some cases it's made legal, and in some cases people vote it down. In most cases, in most states, the votes tend to be quite close, but either by referendum, by legislation, or in some states by legal decisions, medical aid in dying is legal in a wide number of states today. The ethical basis for these laws is autonomy, or the right to self-determination. And we'll talk about this a little bit too. These values are deeply enshrined in American culture: individualism, autonomy, independence. And so the arguments about these practices tend to take the form of proponents stressing the importance of individualism and autonomy, of people's right to do what they want with their own body, of deciding when and how they will die, versus people who oppose the laws generally talking about the potential for abuse, the slippery slope towards involuntary euthanasia, with fears about whether this will be used in a discriminatory way against people with disabilities, against people who are disempowered, against people who don't have insurance, against minorities, or against women, and generally be used in ways that don't promote individualism, autonomy, and independence, but instead are used for other purposes. Let's just talk about Oregon, which was the first state to legalize this, and how they did it. They passed a law called the Death with Dignity Act. And here were the restrictions in order to ask a physician for a prescription for a lethal medication. That is, it was called physician-assisted suicide then. It's now called medical aid in dying. One had to be an adult, age 18 or older, an Oregon resident, able to make and communicate healthcare decisions, and, importantly, have a terminal illness in which doctors estimated less than 6 months to live. Each of these could be modified, and in some European countries or some states, one doesn't have to be an adult, one doesn't have to be a citizen or a legal resident, and the questions of whether one can make or communicate decisions are complicated. Terminal illness is also a somewhat fuzzy category. Doctors are not terrifically good at predicting who's going to die within 6 months. And in some places, instead of or in addition to terminal illness, laws or regulations allow assisted suicide in the face of unendurable suffering or terrible suffering, so one needn't be terminally ill. In Oregon, the patient must make 2 oral requests to the doctor at least 15 days apart and provide a written witnessed request. The prescribing doctor and a consulting doctor have to confirm the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the patient's decisional capacity. They have to certify that the patient does not have a treatable psychiatric condition or psychological disorder. The prescribing physician must inform the patient of alternatives and must request of the patient, but not require, they notify the next of kin that this is going to happen. And then they have to report the fact that they are prescribing lethal medications to a state agency. What do we know about how this works in Oregon? This was a paper as of about 6 years ago. It's a little bit more recent data. DWDA is Death with Dignity Act. You can see on this that more people requested prescriptions for lethal medications than actually took them, and that the number is steadily rising, although it is not huge. By 2013, only about 120 patients got prescriptions, and maybe about a little over half of those took the lethal medication. There are over 33,000 deaths per year in Oregon, and about 70 per year follow physician-assisted suicide. It has increased since the law passed from about 0.1% to 0.4% of all deaths. And that's shown on this for both Oregon and Washington, which passed its law a little later. This is per 1,000 deaths. So in the year 2000, it was 1 per 1,000 or 0.1%, rising to almost 0.4% in the more recent years. Who takes advantage of this are the fears of discriminatory practices against disempowered people borne out by the data. It doesn't seem to be, it's about half men, half women, maybe slightly more men. It's mostly white people, although that's true for the states of Oregon and Washington. Mostly people who've had some college education, and most of the people who have health insurance, or at least a similar proportion to the population. The diseases, cancer and neurologic conditions, are the most common, with lung disease, cardiac disease, and other following. Most, 76% of patients were enrolled in hospice at the time they took their lethal dose of medication. So are these people exercising autonomy? Are they making a self-determination decision? This is the fundamental basis of these practices. It's incorporated into the legal concept of informed consent. Most states have safeguards, like Oregon, to request 2 weeks apart, 2 doctors certifying that the patient has decisional capacity. And these criteria play an important role in the way we think about proper end-of-life decisions, in the way we think that they ought to be made, that patients who don't have decisional capacity should not be making these decisions. Family members should not be making them on behalf of loved ones, although that too is a bit of a slippery slope. Now, these ideas of autonomy and independence and self-determination and authenticity are all related concepts, but there are important differences. Most people don't make these decisions all by themselves. Family members often participate either for competent patients or for incompetent patients. And the role of healthcare professionals is crucial in helping people understand what their options are, the pros and cons of different choices, and perhaps even helping people understand their own motivations and their own values. This gets complicated, though, and let me illustrate that with the story of a case. This was a case written by a psychiatrist, Jodi Halpern, in her book, From Detached Concern to Empathy. And she presented the case to raise the question about whether we should evaluate people's motives or reasons for wanting to end their own life. In this case, it was not for assisted suicide, but for what might be called passive euthanasia, withdrawal of life support. Dr. Halpern presented the case of a 56-year-old woman who had lots of health problems. She had diabetes, she had end-stage kidney disease, she was on dialysis, and as sometimes happens for people with diabetes, she had peripheral vascular disease and ended up getting gangrene of the leg. and needed an amputation. In her particularly tragic story, this had happened to the other leg 2 years before, and she had an amputation of that leg. But she did well and had good rehabilitation after the first amputation. She lives with her husband. She used a wheelchair, and although she was a little depressed, according to Halpern, after the amputation, she quickly got over that and was doing pretty well. Now, however, she needs the other leg amputated. The doctor sat down and talked about her prognosis with amputation alone, that is, in an otherwise healthy person. There's a 20% 5-year survival. If you have kidney disease on top of that, survival goes down to just 10%. But quality of life can be good with decent potential for rehab. And when it comes to rehab, there doesn't seem to be much difference between losing one leg and losing both legs. In both cases, you might need a prosthesis, you might need a wheelchair, but you can live independently. Without amputation, in this case, the gangrene would progress and the patient would likely die within weeks from sepsis. And given all these facts, the patient consented to amputation. Post-operatively, she did well, and then, to the doctor's surprise, the patient informed the doctors that she wanted to stop dialysis and die. She didn't give any reason. She just seemed to be in excruciating pain, and the doctors, puzzled by her sudden change of heart, requested a psychiatry consultation, asking whether she's competent to make this decision and whether the psychiatrist can help figure out the reasons why, after consenting to a big operation like an amputation, presumably with the goal of surviving, she now has suddenly changed her mind and won't give any reason for the change of mind. Dr. Halpern was the consultant, and in her book she describes how she walked into the patient she calls Ms. G's room and was shocked to see a child-sized bony woman curled up under the covers, eyes closed, head shrouded with her back to the world. She was in obvious pain. Her face was tensed and her mouth wide open as if to yell, although she remained silent. And Halpern says he reminded her of Edward Munch's famous painting, The Scream, a person who's in obvious psychological distress for no obvious reason. Halpern says that her first impression was this was not a patient who had the capacity to make decisions. In fact, she writes in View of Her Agony, the question of whether she had capacity seemed strangely detached from the problem at hand. Halpern thought that before allowing her to make a decision to stop her dialysis, it would be crucial to figure out what exactly was causing her pain. It was not a typical post-operative pain. She was getting massive doses of morphine to control any physical pain, but this suffering seemed to be psychological. As Halpern explored the case further, she learned that the woman's husband had just informed Ms. G that he was no longer in love with her, no longer wanted to stay married, and in fact was moving out and had found somebody else, so that Ms. G's pain was the result of this abandonment rather than the result of physical pain. The book goes on to give a detailed discussion then of whether Ms. G should be considered to have decisional capacity, to be competent, to be making authentic decisions, and what the responsibility of her doctors or the psychiatrists were to try to figure out how to relieve her psychic pain so that she could act in a way that was consistent with her values. This question comes up frequently in end-of-life decision-making. This was a study of patients who received lethal doses of drugs compared to other hospice patients. It was done by a psychiatrist in Oregon in the first years after their Death with Dignity Act was passed. And what I want to highlight is that the most common characteristics of these patients were not that they were in physical pain, but they feared loss of control, loss of independence, mental decline, or becoming a burden to others, compared to the number who said that they were in pain. The different shades of gray going across the graph are more than or much more than other hospice patients, about the same, or the white bars on the right side, less than other hospice patients. Pain was much less than other hospice patients. So is it appropriate to question people's motives or reasons rather than just looking at their level of competence or decisional capacity? Most philosophers, even those who are big proponents of autonomy and self-determination, like John Stuart Mill, said it absolutely is appropriate. He writes, it would be a great misunderstanding of his libertarian doctrine to suppose that it is one of selfish indifference, which pretends that human beings have no business with each other's conduct of life, that they should not concern themselves about the well-doing or well-being of one another. Instead of any diminution, there is a need for a great increase of disinterested exertion to promote the good of others. I would interpret this to mean that in a case like Ms. G, doctors have an obligation to probe and question and see whether Ms. G could understand or accept the fact that her current motivation may be an acute reaction to an acute psychological trauma, and that she may change her mind if she waits a few days. Herman Melville explored this as well by trying to figure out what the relationship between preferences and values in his great and haunting story, Bartleby the Scrivener. He presents someone who prefers not to do certain things. And when Bartleby is asked, will you then not do them? Bartleby continues to say, I prefer not to. Charles Taylor is a philosopher who wrote a great book on the making of modern identity called Sources of the Self. And in this, he talks about how one cannot be a self on one's own. Instead, require what he describes as webs of interlocution, by which our language of deliberation is continuous with our language of assessment. That is, how we come to a decision is related to the ways we decide whether somebody is making an authentic or a competent or a rational decision. It's in conversation with other people, deliberating together, assessing together, and coming to shared decisions. So these concepts are key to probing whether a person ought to be allowed to end their life or kill themselves. And for doctors and nurses, one of the key concepts is the degree to which we should try to shape their decisions, or use what Nobel Prize-winning economist Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein described as nudges to help people or improve decisions about health, wealth, and happiness. They describe something called choice architecture, which refers to the practice of influencing choice by organizing the context in which people make decisions. This is, after all, what the Oregon Death with Dignity Act does. It says, we are going to permit this practice, but we will tell you the context in which it is permitted. You need to have a terminal illness. You can't have a psychiatric illness. You need to have stable preferences and repeat them over time. You need to be certified by not one, but two doctors. And within that choice architecture, then we will permit you to exercise your autonomy. Within that choice architecture, too, doctors can shape people's decisions by nudges, or as Thaler defines that, an aspect of choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. That is, all the options are still on the table, but by the way we present the options, we can sometimes influence the choices that people make. If you think of this in light of, say, decisions about CPR or DNR orders, one could imagine a conversation in which a doctor says, you are critically ill, you're in the ICU, do you want us to do CPR? You should know that CPR is pretty brutal. This one was actually about a baby, but your baby will suffer, it probably won't work anyway, do you want us to try it? Versus if your baby or if you stop breathing, do you want us to try to save your life? That framing, that choice architecture might lead to very different decisions. Thaler and Sunstein talk about this as libertarian paternalism. Seems like an oxymoron. There's a very fine line between the paternalism implicit in the notion of choice architecture and the libertarianness, which doesn't curtail any choices, but sees the process as helping people to make choices for themselves. A related notion is the idea of relational autonomy. That is, as Charles Taylor described, identities are formed and realized within the context of relationships, so that an empathic doctor, like a good psychotherapist, might, through conversation, help people understand their own values and thus make more authentic choices. Perhaps that's what Dr. Halpern was trying to do with Ms. G in her efforts to slow the process by which Ms. G was refusing dialysis, eventually refusing fluid and nutrition or other life-supporting interventions, and to say, let's unpack the reasons for your decision and see whether they reflect your true values. So there's a shaky foundation of autonomy with end-of-life decisions. There's empirical evidence and good philosophical reasons to think that people do not think clearly about their own deaths, and therefore there's a crucial role for doctors as both interpreters of people's wishes and protectors of people's ability to make choices, decisions to end one's life, certainly curtail the ability to make future choices. Let me finish up by talking about a few more subtleties and which choices ought to be made for which patients. Lynn Jansen and Dan Solmesi wrote an article in which they tried to distinguish 3 different end-of-life practices that they called terminal sedation, palliative sedation, and sedation of the imminently dying. Note, these are all not medical aid in dying, but they are perhaps what might be considered aggressive palliative care. These are all legal in every state in the United States because they are not considered aid in dying or euthanasia. But in each, Jansen and Solmesi write, the patient is close to death, has one or more symptoms that can't be treated with standard palliative care. The treatment has a dose-dependent side effect of sedation and may lead to respiratory depression or apnea, that is, stopping breathing. And the treatment is given to patients who have a do not resuscitate and a do not intubate order, so that if it does lead to respiratory depression or they stop breathing, the do not resuscitate, do not intubate order means you won't offer life-sustaining treatment. Keep this in mind as you think about how exactly these practices are similar to or different than euthanasia or aid in dying, and why these are legal, whereas euthanasia is not. In offering any of the 3, Jansen and Solmesi say the patient need not be imminently dying. The symptom that we treat is consciousness that one is not yet dead. The intent of treatment is to render the patient unconscious, and other treatments are withheld or withdrawn. They give examples. Case 1 is a 47-year-old with advanced amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, severe muscle weakness, who is unable to eat by mouth and is on a ventilator at night. Psychiatrists have seen the patient and said they are not depressed. The patient asks the doctor to put her in a coma and to withhold nutrition and hydration. The doctor does this, and she dies 4 days later. Case 2, a 30-year-old with end-stage bone cancer, for whom no further chemotherapy is available, already getting high-dose opiates for pain, which leads to one of the side effects of opiates, painful muscle jerking. And Joe, the patient, is groggy but alert and says, give me whatever it takes to control the pain and this muscle jerking. The doctor increases the opiates, adds some benzodiazepine like Valium, and Joe stops breathing and dies 3 days later. In case 3, a 56-year-old with a metastatic brain tumor who chooses to forego treatment because they don't want any brain damage, then decides also to stop eating and to refuse artificial nutrition and hydration. A week later, probably as a result of electrolyte imbalance from dehydration, becomes severely agitated. Doctor prescribes sedating medication to ensure the patient's comfort. The patient dies 2 days later. Are these morally equivalent choices? Are they euthanasia? Are they something we can distinguish from euthanasia? Jansen and Solmese call case 1 sedation towards death, case 2 sedation of the imminently dying, and case 3 voluntary refusal of life-sustaining interventions with physician support and collaboration in a patient who was not imminently dying, or at least could have chosen treatment. They highlight the rule of double effect, which has been used in these situations to distinguish permissible from impermissible practices. The doctrine of double effect says you have a treatment that has 2 effects. 1, it relieves pain. 2, it may cause the patient to stop breathing. The outcomes would be morally impermissible if the goal was to stop breathing. But if the goal is unintended, even if it's foreseen and likely, then the doctrine of double effect says those treatments are permissible. It's a distinction between what intends and what one would avoid if possible, but that's reasonably foreseeable. And the question is, does the doctor intend to make the patient dead, or is the goal of treatment to relieve suffering? The rule of double effect says it's not immoral to render a patient unconscious if the goal of treatment is not that, but pain control. Unconsciousness or death is not the means to pain control, and one has a proportionate reason. That is, you're not doing this to treat a mild headache, but treating severe pain and suffering. Some people find this doctrine useful. Other people find it to be hypocritical and suggest that instead it's permissible to have death as the goal of treatment. In fact, medical aid in dying specifically says that's the goal of treatment and doesn't use the doctrine of double effect as a cover to say that's not the intention. Permeates end-of-life decisions. It may lead to conscientious refusals by doctors and nurses. It certainly blurs the distinction between aggressive palliative care and active euthanasia. Let me finish by just briefly talking about active euthanasia in countries where it is legal. It's legal in the Netherlands, Belgium, Colombia, and Luxembourg, and assisted suicide is legal in Switzerland, and Switzerland is the only country where it's available to tourists. In the Netherlands in 1985, 4.3% of deaths followed voluntary euthanasia or assisted suicide. In the Netherlands, they consider these to be all part of the same practice. Whether the patient takes the medication or the doctor gives it seems to them both legally and morally irrelevant. In Belgium, there were fewer deaths initially, but they are catching up to the Netherlands. This graph shows the rise over the last 20 years in euthanasia and assisted suicide in the Netherlands, from about 2,000 cases to now approaching 7,000 cases. The rate of rise is similar to the rate of rise of assisted suicide in Oregon. It's gone up by a factor of 3 or 4, but started at a higher percentage of deaths, and therefore is now about 10 times as high as a percentage of all deaths. In conclusion, I didn't finish my conclusion slide, but let me highlight a few aspects of this that I think are crucial. First, most deaths follow decisions to withhold or withdraw something. Second, there are many practices around the end of life that require subtle distinctions between active euthanasia, passive euthanasia, voluntary and involuntary, patients with decisional capacity, or patients who don't have decisional capacity. in each case, there must be a nuanced, subtle conversation, or in most cases, many conversations between doctors, patients, often other healthcare professionals. In many cases, there are many subspecialists involved, nurses, social workers, palliative care doctors, chaplains, and on the family side, there are usually parents or adult children of elderly people who all participate in these decisions and try to come up with the best answer. There are complicated and contentious cases. Sometimes there are intractable disagreements, but perhaps surprisingly, in most cases, healthcare professionals and families can sit down, can talk about what is going on clinically, can explore various options, and can come to a mutually agreeable decision. What will the future hold here? It seems like it's going towards greater and greater acceptance of both medical aid in dying and of decisions to withhold or withdraw life-sustaining treatment. This partially reflects the fact that there are more life-sustaining treatments to be withdrawn. And so because these are available, people are forced to make choices about which ones to accept and which ones not to accept. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there with you. Would love to participate in discussion and take your questions, but this has been a fascinating morning, and I hope people found it useful and learned something. Thank you very much.
All right. We are grateful for Dr. Lantos, as well as the rest of the panelists, the Funeral Consumer Alliance Board, most especially Kate Sargent, who's out there in the lobby, who has laid her life on the line the last 6 months, dealing with all of us crazy people around the coronavirus and how to manage this. And she's been a tremendous asset to our board. So we are very happy that this has gone off so well and on time. So I also want to thank All Souls for hosting us and providing the tech support. Angie Martinez out there, who's rocking it on the Facebook. And for those of you social workers, I know you want to know how to get your ethics. So this, and nurses as well. So you all should have or will receive a Survey Monkey. We want all of you to do an evaluation of your experience today. It helps us plan our future meetings. At the end of that, you put what your discipline is, if it's a social worker or nurse, and by that, we will create our list to send out your CEUs. So be assured, you are on a list. If you replied back to the email and or did the Survey Monkey, you are good to go. You may contact us if something doesn't happen in the next week and you do not receive that. Please be in touch. Those of you that are social workers, I speak to many of you. I know many of you are very excited about our 2020 funeral price survey that is on our website currently. So just go to funerals, plural, kc.org. And I think you got to scroll down a little bit to the bottom, I believe, and there is a link to our latest price survey. And so have fun printing that out. Give that out to your folks and your families. And if you have any questions around any of those resources for you, all of our previous price surveys are on our website as well as green burial or home burial. Our board is here for you to answer your questions. So feel free to email us or call us. As well, if you need speakers for any online trainings you have, our board is here at your disposal and would love to educate on many of the topics today that you heard from. We also love volunteers, so please reach out to us if you have a heart for what we are talking about today, especially educating and advocating around end-of-life death decisions. Thank you so much for coming. We have loved this experience and grateful for our panelists and our board. Have a great day.